I am Marc Silber. I'm a photographer and author in Carmel, California. Our guest today is Mads Peter Iversen. He's a fine art landscape photographer living in Denmark. And Mads, welcome to Advancing Your Photography. It's really great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Marc.
What are some of the key points that you use every time you pick up a camera, or maybe even before you pick one up?
I try to go with the flow. Whenever I go out into nature, sometimes I have a plan for what I want to do. I have a vision and I have a goal for the specific photo I want. Other times I more or less just go with the flow. I try to keep an open mind, let me put it like that, and adjust to the weather when I'm out, and try to be open to different options when I'm out. Many of the locations I visit are the iconic spots, so you often have like a really preconceived idea about what you want.
Yeah.
So often I go for that first, and then hopefully I can manage to somehow get some originality into it. And I don't let my gear dictate what I want to catch. Like I don't always only use a wide angle lens.
Right.
I just as much use the long end or the mid-range focal lengths.
I think maybe a good way to do this is we'll go through your images and I can ask you questions about them because I'm so curious. Here we are with a lot of geometry. You're in the foreground and there's 1, 2, 3 prominent projections coming through. Lots of geometry. I'm a huge fan of geometry. You know, in my composition book, I wrote about Henri Cartier-Bresson. Basically said that geometry is a pleasure for him because you're really tying all these different elements together. And you obviously use a lot of geometry as well. But tell me about this image.
Yeah, I completely agree. When I talk about composition too, and it's also something I talk about in my newest ebook, is geometry. Think geometry when you are out, because that's more or less the best way to make an aesthetically pleasing composition. Think in geometry and geometrical shapes. So yeah, this photo here is from the Faroe Islands also. And yeah, these are background islands, and they really stand out like that. It's a single exposure, just straight on, and I'm using what is probably equal to about 400 or 500 millimeter to get this very strong compression.
I thought so. Yeah, I mean, looking at it, obviously those islands are, they're compressed together, but that's a really amazing effect.
Yeah, from the foreground to the furthest away background island, I think there's about 20 or 25 kilometers.
I love the way you're silhouetted. I love the way you're capturing yourself in your images. You know, I've never done that. It's fantastic. When did you start that? I think that, first of all, let me just say this. I find that a landscape with a person in it is much more interesting than a landscape by itself for many reasons. One, we as human beings, we like to see another human being, but it also gives you the scale. So when you're inserting, but we don't often have other people around. So I never figured out what you have done. But when did you start doing that, putting yourself in your images?
It's something I have been doing for some years now, but it has really taken off in 2019, and especially to use myself as scale, not just as a person in the photo to make like an adventurous feeling, but really to emphasize scale. I've really been doing that for the past year or so, maybe a little bit further back, 1.5 years. And
it's a really strong compositional point that I also included in my book, and Bob Holmes, National Geographic photographer, calls it punctuation. And by putting that punctuation point, it really makes the image pop. I mean, it would be an interesting image by itself, but it completely changes the way you feel about it when you see you, and especially I think being silhouetted. So that's brilliant.
Yeah, you even have like in this case here, and that wasn't on purpose when I posed for the photo, but I'm kind of posing in the same way as that background small C stack, which is actually called the wedge, that C stack.
Uh-huh.
So it looks as if I'm like mirrored in that background C
Oh
stack. So
yeah.
that's like an extra thing on top of it.
There's a lot of interesting things about this photograph. The darkness of the roof and the siding with pretty white windowsills. I think that's amazing because your eye is just drawn right into that. Where is this and what's the story?
Also Iceland, and
Okay.
it is from my very first tour to Iceland as a landscape photographer, and one of my highest priority photos to get in Iceland on that tour. And when I went there, it was like, cloudy, and I wasn't really sure that I got anything good from there. I knew I wanted to just like straight on like that, just to get like, again, very, very simple central composition. So I started playing a lot around with it in Camera Raw and Photoshop when I came home, and I really managed. Again, it's a single exposure, so there were actually quite a lot of texture in those clouds, but you can hardly see it on the raw file. So I really managed to pull out a lot of those details in the clouds, and really again darken down the clouds and make this very super moody photo.
One thing I like to point out, and I like to see this, this sort of worshiping of the rule of thirds, like it's a law. And if you break it, the photography police are going to give you a ticket. And, there's so many examples of where photographers have disobeyed that rule. And this is an example of it. Straight square in the middle of the frame, there's your subject, which works. And it's perfect.
Yeah, the rule of thirds can be interpreted in a few different ways, but I think the most popular one is to place your subject or focal point in one of those intersection points.
Yeah.
And when I usually teach people composition, I hardly mention the rule of thirds, because I would say that it actually destroys your understanding of composition. Because there's so many other elements that you need to take into account before you can actually apply the rule of thirds, such as balance in the photo.
That's right. That's so true. Yes, indeed. Well, I wrote a book that has 83 compositional techniques in it. I kind of wrote it like this is a cookbook, a recipe book, and you don't have to use it. You don't have to use any of them. You could use 3 or 4 to combine. But just like if you're learning how to cook, it's good to have some recipes to start from, and then work from there. So you got to know how to make a souffle. You should read the recipe, but after a while, you don't necessarily have to follow that recipe.
Yeah, I often talk about composition as compositional tools that you can apply to a given scene, because obviously some of the scenes, like trying to force a framework like the rule of thirds or the golden ratio into a scene where it's simply not there. It's just a waste of time.
It's a waste of time. It's so true. And here's another good example of not following that rule. Is there any final advice you'd like to leave these guys with in terms of advancing their photography?
Do what you like to do. Do what you think is fun, and don't let other people tell you what you should or ought to do. But of course, learn from others and try to avoid all these unwarranted mistakes. But let it be fun. If it's not fun, then there's no point in doing it.
Absolutely. Great advice. Mads, thanks again. And we really enjoyed having you on.
Thank you.
Hey, if you haven't already subscribed, if you're watching this, make sure you do enable the bell so you don't miss any of our great episodes. Leave your comments, leave your likes, do all those things that we love you to do. And remember to get out and capture your own images of life. Love you guys. Take care. Keep advancing your photography, and we'll see you again real soon.